Wonderful, thank you so very much. And again, I mean, I'm in awe of all four speakers for not only keeping to time, but also managing to really provide some rich textured insights, and I think across a range of perspectives. And I think in particular in relation to issues around sort of the World Bank and the World Bank response. I mean, I think that your last slide, Helidah, is something it would be great to come back to, and I might ask you to speak specifically to that. But as you close, you know, your point about different outcomes across different parts of the continent, and what it means when we see some regions being more likely to develop particular interventions versus in other spaces, and what that means in terms of improved responses. And I also hope that in the discussion we could perhaps come back to the issues around you know, World Bank's focus that is drawing together issues around poverty reduction, the language of shared prosperity, coming back to the linkages around migration for development, thinking about impacts on host communities, and if and how that lens around forced displacement does or doesn't talk to the global compacts. And here I'm particularly thinking around the ways in which the compacts position safe and regular movement, and what that means in terms of thinking about the forms of informal work and their importance and their contribution to fiscus in different contexts. And I'm particularly interested in whether the compacts, you know, in particular, as I say, the GCM, but is that something that will support assisting so-called lower skilled entrepreneurs in developing a regularized status or not? Is it going to provide fuel to states to further restrict movement, make regularization and moving through regular pathways more difficult? Is the language of safe and regular something that actually is about restricting movement rather than supporting movement? So I think there's a range of different connections there with some of the other inputs we've had. So we've got some questions in the chat, and what I thought would be good, we've got about 20 minutes. And so I will do my best to cover some of the questions that are here in the chat, and try and link those together, giving each speaker a chance to further contribute and react. And please continue to add any comments, any questions, or any key resources that we might want to be sharing. James, I wondered if we could come back to you to start with, and thinking about, one is about if you could briefly perhaps give some insight around the specific question around responses to women and child protection, but also the issue around, I think the question around xenophobia and xenophobic violence is incredibly important, and thinking about what this has meant in the context of Messina, and what you might attribute this stability, as it were, to, because we know that the tensions around immigration are in different ways at the local level and at the national level, perhaps intersecting with the ways we think about protection measures. So I wonder, James, if you'd like to reflect briefly on women and children, and spend a few more minutes discussing your monitoring work around xenophobia. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Maybe let me start off by the issue of xenophobia. You will recall that in my presentation, I did mention about Messina being a community that was largely populated by the migrants who came to Messina to work in the mine. And around about that time, what happened is that the majority of them were young men that came through, and they settled in Messina and eventually got married. So the majority of them over time, they naturalized and to become South African citizens. So in Messina, 75% of the population is of Zambian, Malawian, Zimbabwean, Mozambican origin, and the majority of them are related. So it is very difficult to engage with them in terms of issues that relate to xenophobia, because then we are related. How do you start fighting with me because we are related? You are married to my sister, you come from Mozambique, and I come from Malawi or Zimbabwe. We are related. There's no way we can start fighting, because immediately you start fighting, you are fighting your sister or you are fighting your brother. So that kind of relationship has developed into one big family that says we can't fight each other. And then there's understanding, tolerance, and cohesion as a result of that. In terms of women and children and protection programs, the fact that on the onset, when there was a crisis in Zimbabwe and other countries further afield, from 2000 and particularly from 2008, one thing that Messina Legal Advice Office did was to establish a relationship with community-based, faith community-based organization, and established safety places, which we call shelters. So when the women and the girls that are more vulnerable came through, they were accommodated in those shelters, and that's providing protection for them. And in the process, well, as much as the laws of refugees do not accept encampment, but for purposes of assisting the women and the children, there was a need for us to establish shelters. And those shelters have worked very well, because the women and children have been protected, and up until they are regularized in terms of them getting the necessary documentation and move further afield to other cities and towns for better job opportunities. So in these shelters, there are programs to assist them upon being received. There are programs that are in place to assist the women and children. And one of the programs is to allow them to be accommodated in the schools, in the local schools that are in Messina. And well, as much as we've been getting, there has been very difficult times of getting them to be accommodated because they don't have the necessary documentation. There's been a very big fight with the Department of Education. This is why we did a lot of advocacy work and awareness, and the Department of Education didn't have a problem in accommodating them. So they have been accommodated, but the biggest challenge is when the girls are at matric level and an ID is required. And that has been a very, very big challenge. And organizations such as Save the Children and other organizations have been very vocal, and they've done a lot of advocacy work in terms of the Department of Education to accept the migrant, particularly girls and unaccompanied boys and separated ones. So there are programs that are running in the shelter, and they've been very helpful, because the majority of these girls and unaccompanied boys and separated ones have really benefited. I can tell you that
James,
from the boys' shelter.
Oh, so sorry to interrupt, but thank you for such a rich feedback. I'm just aware of time, so I'm just going to move to the other speakers. But thank you so much for these reflections. And for me, one of the things that's interesting is about whether or not compacts are supporting this language of access, for example, to documentation and irregular status for children who are born in the country. And we know that that's some of the tensions around the ways in which the compacts, how far they are stretched, how far they go, and whether or not they work as advocacy tools that could be used to support those processes. So thank you for your reflections there. I'm just going to turn now and come back to you, Asmita, who was our first speaker. And I wanted to come back to you about the question around where trade fits, and really thinking about sort of, your thoughts on where trade fits into this whole conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jo. I mean, I think it's a little bit later to the scene than social rights, than human rights, and the other more obvious links. But I think I think one of the things that I've been doing some research with Nick on this particular on another project looking at migration in Southern Africa, and I've been looking at the trade and migration sort of links. And I think what's becoming increasingly important is that just like gender, there's a need for gender mainstreaming, there's a need for almost migration mainstreaming. And then I think in a region like Southern Africa, where you've got high levels of unemployment, and you've also got high levels of youth unemployment and high levels of poverty, promoting and advocating for free movement of people is politically unpalatable, right? So you've got the political reality on the one side versus the benefits that something like enabling trade, bringing, enabling safe transfer of remittances, making it easier for cross-border trade to take place, enabling circular mobility so that you can spread skills around a region. All of those are things that will bring long-term gains, but may not necessarily satisfy your 5-term electoral system. So I think that one of the challenges perhaps is that the benefits that trade and migration play off each other or can offer communities and societies is a much longer term approach than what might be immediate needs in a country. And I think that there's an increasing appreciation of the importance of movement of people and the ways in which this can be enabled. So, you're not going to get free movement of people initially, it's for whatever reasons, but you can start off with plans that make it a reality. You can start off by having, recognition of skills. You can start off by having accreditation of certain categories of people that make it easier to move, and not to get, and then I think importantly, not to get hung up on just white collar workers or white collar professionals as well. Developing countries need a vast range of skills in the country, from welders to chartered accountants to doctors and everything in between. So I think looking at doing the needs assessment, and that's the point about the data and the evidence, right? You can't make policy if you don't know what your country needs or what your country has access of, or whatever it is that you can bring to the table. I think that kind of data is really important. And then from at a bigger level in terms of trade, we have the AFCFTA, the Continental Free Trade Area, that's currently underway. We're going to have trade and services, we're going to have investment, we're going to have all of these things that require people behind it. Trade and services doesn't take place by itself. Investment doesn't take place by itself. It requires people to facilitate that. So the question is, how do you advance that? And I think that this is something that is becoming more obvious in the need on the African continent. And one of the things I think that would be a good way to look at that is start regionally and then build up continentally, because there's some regions like ECOWAS and the ASC that have moved further ahead compared to a region like SADC. So, learning from each other, understanding the domestic context in Southern Africa. South Africa's role is unequal compared to the rest of the country. So you have to understand that in the way in which migration management takes place and the way in which trade takes place. But the idea being that there are gains for host countries, there are gains for countries of origin, and finding where are the common links, what do we want to build on? And even if that means trilaterally moving forward first, then maybe that's the point at which you start, so that other countries see the benefit and they're like, oh, okay, well, maybe, we can give this a go too. And I think it's really about having baby steps approach, and the political will is important, but as our colleague was saying earlier, the importance of local communities, you know, the use of the community stations, for example, that he was saying to bring it back to that, the role that we play at a local level, the role in which trade and migration plays at a local level is equally important, not just high level political rhetoric. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic, thanks, Asmita. And again, I mean, you know, these are issues that, you know, there's so much more to be unpacked and discussed. So again, thank you for sharing so much in the few minutes I've been able to give you. I was thinking that, you know, if we could move to Helidah now, just briefly, but I've cheekily put up your final slide, as I know that you said it would be good to come back to that. And I think that what you've raised here are, in a way, exactly the challenges that for many years people working within the migration sector, the refugee sector in South Africa are facing, including sort of, you know, colleagues within government structures, for example, who are also trying to develop changed responses. So yeah, I just wondered if you might want to just use a couple of minutes just to expand a little bit on this and your thoughts of what do we need to be doing?
Not sure if I can answer the latter part of your question, but I think, well, there's certainly challenges that are specific to the World Bank, and that really speaks to the first two, that for, I think, some historical and one could argue legitimate reasons, the South African government's disposition to institutions like the World Bank and IMF is a suspicious one, if we could put it that way. And so they're more interested in engaging in the typical work that the World Bank is known for, so infrastructure, advising on electricity and the like. I think the World Bank still has to do a lot of work in changing the perception that we're new to this agenda. We've been working on it even prior to really explicitly saying so, before, you know, before we started about 7 years ago more actively and put financing behind it. All our projects in some way or another, if you're working in Afghanistan, you necessarily are going to be working with refugees and refugee communities or IDPs. And so making that clear that we're not new to this agenda is important. But to your point, I mean, migration is a politically contentious issue really anywhere in the world, and it's of course certainly a very contentious one in Southern Africa, in South Africa. And I think that made, you know, further engaging on this topic with the government very difficult. And I'd go as far to say that, you know, our findings, as robust and rigorous as they are, it's very difficult for a government to say to its constituents, actually, migrants are creating jobs, when it won't necessarily resonate with the constituents' lived experience. And so I think one of our lessons has been, you know, it's not enough to produce a report that says one thing. It's also, well, what is the political environment and what's possible in that? And there certainly were some people within the government who were happy to see this report and wanted to engage with it and see how we can use this data to improve joblessness in South Africa, but politically it's very difficult. And there's still a perception amongst certain governments on the continent, especially, that one would be borrowing from the World Bank for non-citizens, which again is not something that's politically palatable. And so that understanding that actually a lot of the financing we give is on a grant basis is something we need to be more clear about. And really, it's not clear to us whether this issue is a political priority for the government. Again, especially in the advent of COVID, to be seen to be focusing on migrants, refugees, would pose a challenge for the government. And finally, just to add, I think, you know, some of Kuda's points really resonated around, you know, the stark distinction between refugees and migrants. We have the same sort of bureaucratic distinction within the World Bank. And for some of us, that's been really difficult in doing the kind of research we did, because of course in Southern Africa and in many other places, really, that distinction just doesn't bear, is not the empirical reality. So I think that, many of our institutions need to really need to think about this distinction and whether it's a useful distinction. It certainly isn't in Southern Africa. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And again, I mean, this is another, I mean, I would love to see if there was interest from, World Bank and other stakeholders and really unpacking this issue further, because it is, as you say, something that becomes divisive and becomes challenging to move forward. It is contentious, and categories we know can present even more challenges around responses moving forward. And I think what's interesting is just tying it to one other thing that has linked to other work that we've been involved in looking at COVID, for example, is that whilst on the one hand, there is a clear concern for the state or other states to be seen to be engaging with, migrants over citizens and that perception. But we've also seen from work across the continent that COVID has also made far more visible the importance of movement and migration for livelihoods and for development. And it's also meant that I think some states, the ways in which borders were closed, the ways in which service and trade was abruptly stopped, has also exposed states to a different reality around the importance of migration for development, migration as a clear livelihood approach across the continent. And I think that's something we also need to be keeping an eye on. So thank you so much for that. Kuda, thanks for your patience, and we will wrap up in the next 5 minutes. But Kuda, I wanted to ask if you could come back to the ZDP and the Zimbabwean dispensation permits and think about sort of the ways in which these stretch the language around protection. So over to you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jo. Yeah, I really appreciate the conversation because it really brings out, I want to start by touching on the question by Zenzo in the chat that, are the compacts or these approaches sustainable? Yeah, it might very well be that if we're not careful, and this is something we've been talking about lately, Joe and Nick, and a blog we've been trying to put out around, without the necessary political engagement, you find yourself talking about migration leading to development and then creating, using like an economist model, you identify the areas, because you're kind of assuming that the problem is that there are no gap, people are coming in to take jobs where there's no gaps for, but there's no evidence that even if you filled in those jobs, you wouldn't have the problem, right? So how do you need to make sure that at the community level or not necessarily community level, but the problem of xenophobia goes deeper than, people know that it's linked to development. There's more to it. And I think these ideas are kind of being brought in from also contexts like in Europe, where you can sit down and make these equilibriums around, okay, how many people do we need, blah, 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 fill in the gap, and that's it. And people have protections within the communities they live, or the law is able. But there's bigger issues around people getting attacked, not getting any form of recourse, police not doing their job, and lack of punitive measures people haven't been arrested or convicted for xenophobic violence and all of that. So there's bigger issues to engage, and I think we need to have those at the table before we just simply start importing things we don't know whether they work or not. And the dispensations, the Zimbabwe dispensation permits, I think they certainly present an opportunity, and some of the opportunities, like I mentioned, have to do with how they, documentation gives people access to certain things, certain rights, for example. But obviously there are limitations around who qualifies for it. What is the process? Who can be included? It's almost, people who were included at the beginning are the only ones who get the protection. People who came late don't necessarily get it. And also there's always a sense of anxiety that it creates because it hasn't been streamlined into the sort of migration governance framework. It's more like a plus, like, you get it, are you getting it this time or not? And like a Christmas gift, and people have to literally wait until the last minute. And the question that Shingirai mentioned in the chat around when is this happening? To be frank with you, I don't know. And I just learned from colleagues who've been involved with or engaged with civil society that civil society is also busy still trying to engage. They don't know when it's going to happen, and they're monitoring and evaluating the situation. But again, to wrap up, that is exactly and precisely how the ZSP is a mode of governance, how it works to make sure that people are always anxious, always unsure, and it doesn't really give, and this is what I think Moyo, drawing on Fasim, calls sort of ambivalent hospitality of governing the unwanted. So we really need to see a serious engagement of inclusion, ZSP being streamlined and mainstreamed as a particular sort of sustainable package, if it is to be anything at all for the people it's meant to protect, or at least for the greater majority of them, because it only benefited just under 300,000, where we know there's around 1 million or so, just under over of Zimbabweans as an estimate. So thanks, Joe. I hope I managed to keep to time and respond appropriately.
Wonderful, absolutely. Thank you so much, Kuda, and thank you so much for bearing with us. And I really want to thank the presenters for their really thoughtful contributions, and to colleagues who have joined us from various constituencies, including from, for example, IOM, other civil society organizations, international groups, researchers. We've also got some students on the call, which I think is fantastic. It's really showing us the importance of supporting the next generation of migration research scholars, work that obviously our centre and others on the call are committed to supporting. And so I want to also just flag that on the PROTECT site, you can also access the previous expert forums and discussions, including the recent one that we held last week, looking at LGBT protection issues in the context of LGBT asylum seekers, refugees and migrants within the region. And I think the two sessions have really brought together a range of common and different challenges, and have really highlighted the ways in which the compacts provide opportunities for engagement, but aren't a panacea. And I think that the opportunity to engage across different sectors, particularly thinking about the recent work of the World Bank, I think is incredibly important for sort of helping us in real time unpack the ways in which the South African state in particular is struggling to engage with migration and immigration and protection. So many thanks to you all.